Hey everyone, this is Ben with the Tiger's Den, and today we're going to talk about why you should stop abusing the terms strictly better and strictly worse in Magic the Gathering. Okay, so these words, strictly better and strictly worse, get thrown around a lot, especially in online conversations, and I feel like maybe even more often than not, they're used improperly. So we're going to get kind of down into the muck of the definitions here. So if you just want a quick and easy rule, here it is. Don't say it. Don't use the term strictly better or strictly worse. Just strike it from your vocabulary, and you'll be a lot happier. It tends to confuse people, leads to arguments, things like that, and you just don't need it. You don't need it. So, if you just want one 30-second spiel, there it is. But, if you're still with me, you want to hear more, hold on, here we go. So let's start with some examples here first. Good examples of strictly better or strictly worse cards. Shock versus Lightning Bolt. Obviously, right? I mean, Shock is exactly the same, but it deals one less damage. Everything else about the cards is identical, and you want to deal damage when you cast the card. So, Lightning Bolt, strictly better than Shock. Same with Cancel versus Counterspell. The exact same effect, but Counterspell costs one less mana than Cancel, and you want to have your spells cost less mana. So, clearly, Counterspell, strictly better than Cancel. So, from that, here's our working definition. This is just something that I've come up with, and it's worked pretty well, but it's not perfect, and it's changing, because this is a really tough subject. So, strictly better would mean a card with at least one mechanical or numerical superiority, and no mechanical or numerical inferiorities. But that doesn't really do it. That's not enough, because we're going to get into some things here where that gets a little bit trickier. So, let's do some bad examples now, things that I would say are not actually strictly better or worse, but often are called such. So first we have Evolving Wilds versus Prismatic Vista. When Prismatic Vista came out in Modern Horizons a few months back, some people were saying that this is a strictly better Evolving Wilds. That's pretty cool. And yeah, it's cool that it's a way better Evolving Wilds, but I don't think it's actually strictly better. And this devolved into an argument between many people, not just me, on forums, because some people were saying it is, some people were saying, in my opinion correctly, that it is not. And the reason that I would say it is not is because there's a very clear mechanical distinction between these cards. One of them puts a land into play tapped, the other one makes you lose life. Those are both bad things, and they're very different things. Just because Evolving Wilds is much worse than Prismatic Vista, and I can never see myself running Evolving Wilds when I have access to Prismatic Vista, doesn't mean that Prismatic Vista is a strictly better card than Evolving Wilds, because Loss of Life versus coming into play tapped are such distinct and different mechanisms that you can't say that one compares just one is always better than the other. And especially because if you start saying, okay, well, what if Prismatic Vistas lose 2 life? What if it's lose 3 life? Where is the distinction between it is now no longer strictly better? If they're on this axis where completely different things can be called strictly better or worse, we have to parse how many points in one direction or the other makes it strictly better or worse, when do they become roughly equal, and that gets so messy, and I don't think we want to go there. Another example would be Chandra's Pyrohelix versus Bonecrusher Giant. Okay, so this is a kind of weird one, but hear me out. So, Chandra's Pyrohelix, not really playable. Bonecrusher Giant, fantastic card, and it has that mode for the same cost as Pyrohelix, and the same speed, in the same color, deal 2 damage to any target, and then the Rider effect too. So Bonecrusher Giant is a fantastic card, Chandra's Pyrohelix is barely playable, if that. Bonecrusher Giant, I would say, is not a strictly better card than Chandra's Pyrohelix, and here is why. First, Chandra's Pyrohelix can split the damage. Obviously, that's pretty relevant in a lot of cases. Sometimes you want to kill 2 1/1s. That doesn't mean that you would run Pyrohelix over Bonecrusher Giant. I can't imagine why you would. I can't even imagine running Pyrohelix in the first place in Standard. But Bonecrusher Giant can't do that, so it can't be strictly better, because there's a thing that Chandra's Pyrohelix can do that it can't. Second, Bonecrusher Giant is a creature everywhere except for on the stack. That means that you can't do things like flash it back with Chandra Acolyte of Flame's -2 ability, or a Snapcaster Mage if you're playing it in Modern. You know, I don't know, maybe you're playing it in Modern. So, the fact that it is a different card type almost all of the time is another thing that would disqualify it from being seen as strictly better, even though it is a vastly better card. And for one last one, Drillbit versus Thought Erasure. Obviously, Surveil versus Spectacle, very different, but on top of that, you know, mana cost is different as well, and then, obviously, one of them is just black, Drillbit. One of them, Thought Erasure, is blue-black, and cards that have different mana costs or additional colors in their cost can't be strictly better than another one. So again, Thought Erasure run everywhere that it can be run, usually as a 4-of. Drillbit, not that, but also not strictly worse. So when we're talking about these things, we don't need the term strictly better or worse. We already have a term for those cards. It's better. We don't need to call it strictly better because that's diluting the meaning of strictly better to the point where it doesn't mean anything at all. It just means this card seems better than the other one. Strictly better. You know, let's not do that. Let's not dilute the term. Let's just keep strictly in cases of actual strict superiority. So now we have to add a little more to our definition, because we're going to say it is a card with at least one mechanical or numerical superiority, no mechanical or numerical inferiorities, and minimal mechanical distinction. So minimal, you know, that's a little bit of a dicey word, because now we're giving ourselves edges and things like that, edge cases. So it's not perfect, right? Like I said, this isn't a perfect definition, but that should encompass most things, I feel like. But it's still tricky, right? Because, you know, instant is better than sorcery, right? An instant and a sorcery that do the same thing, but instant should always be strictly better, assuming it's, you know, same cost and all that stuff. But is it always? Maybe it's not, because there are cards like Finale of Promise that check your graveyard for an instant and a sorcery. So we have Tormenting Voice versus Thrill of Possibility. Is Tormenting Voice sometimes not actually strictly worse than Thrill of Possibility because sometimes you want a sorcery in your graveyard instead of an instant? That's a tough question. And I would say personally, no, Tormenting Voice is actually strictly worse than Thrill of Possibility. But actually what I would say is, let's not use the term strictly better or strictly worse when we're talking about things like that, where it's not necessary. We can just say, whoa, this is way better because it's an instant. And when it has this, you know, this is a pretty clear mechanical distinction, which we've ruled out in our previous definition, so maybe we don't need to use that word. Maybe we can just say it's way better. But, you know, if I had to say, obviously I would say that yes, it is strictly better for Thrill of Possibility being an instant than Tormenting Voice being a sorcery. But it's a murky case, right? And you can see here why this makes it difficult to just make a clean rule of, okay, here's what it means. Same thing with things like exile effects versus destroy effects. Obviously, exiling your opponent's stuff is usually way better than putting it in the graveyard, because they can get it back from the graveyard. They can do things like dredge from the graveyard, use it as a resource for delve. But is it actually always strictly better to exile it? Because maybe you're playing a reanimator deck, and maybe you want to grab your opponent's stuff out of their graveyard. Now it's better for you to destroy their stuff than it is to exile it. Again, I would say personally that it's still strictly better. Two cards, all other things being equal, the card that exiles is strictly better than the card that destroys. But that does show you that now there's this corner case where that distinction, even though it might make you run the card over another card, it can still be strictly worse and still be run. So now we're adding one more thing to the definition, where just because a card has a corner case where it's better doesn't disqualify it from still being strictly worse. It can be strictly worse and still played, which is the weird thing. But again, because Magic is a big and complicated game, sometimes things like that happen. One thing that I want to touch on before we leave, too, is I've heard some arguments thrown around in these conversations that I think are unhelpful and should stop being made, personally. And that is things like, well, card X isn't strictly worse than card Y, because if your opponent steals the card or something like that, or your opponent puts a prison on you where you can't cast cards of a certain name, then it's better to have this card. And, okay, it is better if my opponent steals my vanilla 5-mana 5/5 than if they steal my Cavalier of Thorns, right? Because Cavalier of Thorns is bigger, it has extra effects, it has a keyword. That doesn't mean that Cavalier of Thorns is not strictly better than a 5-mana 5/5 that costs 2 green. You know, that's just, like, sure, Agent of Treachery will make me sadder when it steals my Cavalier of Thorns, but that doesn't make Cavalier of Thorns not better in every way than this other hypothetical card. I don't know if there actually is a card. It's like, but let's just use that for argument's sake here. And the other one, you know, cards like Meddling Mage, which gets run in Humans in Modern, and people will say, oh, well, you know, this 5-mana Wrath that's identical to this 4-mana Wrath actually isn't strictly worse, because if your opponent Meddling Mages you out of the first one, you can still cast the second one. And while it's true that in cases like that, you do sometimes want to diversify your board wipes or your cards in general, that's another case where a strictly worse card is being run for a good reason. Just because it is being run does not mean that it is not a strictly worse card than the other one, assuming that everything else is equal and it has just that one numerical inferiority. So anyway, I wish that people would stop making arguments like that. I don't think that it helps the conversation, and I don't think that it is a good piece of the definition. So, anyway, that is going to wrap it up. Thank you very much for watching. It's always so fun doing these, so let me know in the comments, what do you think? Is there something you'd like to add to my definition? Is there something that you think is totally wrong with my definition? Do you think we should just stop using the term altogether? Do you think I'm being way too strict? Do you think that we should just use strictly better to mean way better, you know? Let me know. Let me know what you think. Leave us comments, thumbs up, thumbs down, all that cool stuff. Check back here for more magic and video game content, and we will see you later. Thanks. Bye-bye.